Becoming a better leader is not easy. First, your ego will sting a bit when you realize that you have not arrived and still have room to grow. Second, changing, because here's the reason I think that's important. A lot of times as leaders, we get so focused on growing others, we forget we have to grow, right? Or we get frustrated that others aren't growing, and we forget sometimes. He says, second, changing some of your attitudes, behaviors, and habits can be difficult and even painful. And you could think, well, what is the last, if you were to look at those attitude, behavior, and habit that you changed? Maybe jot that down. What is the last habit, behavior, or attitude that you changed in a productive way? And how painful has it been? Right? Because it's the pain that keeps us from doing it. In a very real sense, you must become a warrior. You must go to war with your ego, your dogmatic opinions, and some of your old ways of doing things, the practices that really don't work. And of course, if we don't battle our ego, we wouldn't even agree with that statement, would we? Practices that don't work. Because our ego tells us that the reason our practices don't work is because the people we're leading are idiots, right? Or they're lazy, or they're uncommitted, right? It's so easy to push that upon the folks that we're leading as opposed to owning it ourselves. He says, there is a price to pay if you want to lead with honor. And then he quotes from The Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King. How many of you have seen that or read it? Okay. I haven't, but it says, I thought this was an incredible quote. He says, there is no freedom without sacrifice. There is no victory without loss. And there is no glory without suffering. And then he asks the question, what are you willing to sacrifice to gain your freedom from the hindrances holding you back? What are you willing to lose to go up to enjoy the victory of greater leadership success? I encourage you to put forth the effort and learn and lean into pain. Even a modest investment will yield big results. So I went back to these three things. You still have to have room to grow, and you have to change your attitude, and you have to be willing to deal with pain. So I looked at those three things and I asked myself, well, what are the skills to lead with honor? And here's the way I did this. I thought, well, what would AI say are the skills, right? Because he's talking about growth, that the most successful leaders today have. And I wanted to just go over these because you may agree with some of them, you may not, but this is what AI thinks as it has scoured the internet of successful leaders and said, this is what skills they have. In other words, these are areas in which to grow. I mean, you can grow in all the areas, right? But these are the skills, right, that we need to be proficient in if we want to become good leaders. But we have to deal with our ego in order to look at them. The first, because we all, every leader thinks they're good at most things. All right. So communication. And then under communication, you notice the first thing he says is active listening. Or he or she, I mean, I don't know if AI is a he or a she, but anyways. And maybe put a score between 1 to 10. 1 being you're not very good. 5 being an area that needs improvement. 7 being somewhat competent. And 10 being I'm awesome. Okay. So I'm between 1 and 10 as we walk through these. Just kind of put your own score on whether you think you're a good active listener. Next is clear and concise communication. So how good are you at making sure people understand what it is you're communicating? And then when it comes to communication, constructive feedback. Providing timely and helpful feedback is essential for fostering growth and development. Right? Are you able, 1, do you value it? So do you do it? 2, are you a truth teller? Right? Just kind of thinking through those things. The second thing that AI says we need to be proficient in is decision making. In order to be a good decision making, according to AI, you need to have strategic thinking. So, how good of a decision maker are you, 1 to 10? And then each one of these proficiencies, where would you rate yourself? Are you a strategic thinker? Analyzing situations, identifying potential outcomes, making informed decisions. And I would say that strategic thinking is different than strategic planning. Okay? Are you a problem solver? Effective leaders are adept at identifying challenges, developing solutions, and implementing them. The next one is decisiveness. Are you decisive? Making timely and effective decisions, even under pressure, is a hallmark of strong leadership. Decisiveness instills confidence in the team. Now, you notice if you're not proficient at communicating, all decision making can become a problem for you, right? Because people don't receive your decisions in a positive way, you know? It's like, if you're not very good at communicating and you say, let's go have pizza, and you get rebellion amongst the family and others, so these kind of build on one another. The third is building relationships. And then here's the deal. If your overall score is greater than the breakdown, you might ask yourself if you were honest with yourself. You know what I'm saying? If you said, I'm a decision maker at an 8, but then when you looked at the components that AI thinks are part of decision making and none of them are higher than a 6, well, you might not be an 8. You might want to reflect upon how good a decision maker you are, right? Doesn't mean for sure that you're not, but it's kind of like somebody who says they're a great basketball player, but they can't shoot, dribble, or run. I guess maybe they're such an awesome passer, but it's unlikely. All right, empathy and compassion, understanding, relating to the emotions and experiences of others fosters a positive and supportive work environment. Trustworthiness, building a reputation for honesty, integrity, and reliability. Relationship building, fostering strong and positive relationships with team members and stakeholders is crucial. So how do you think you are? 1 to 10. 1 being really not very good, 5 being needs improvement, 7 being competent, and 10 being awesome. Number 4, another skill you might say we need to grow in is inspiring and motivating. Inspiring and motivating. Visionary thinking, developing a clear vision for the future and inspiring others to work towards it. Do you forget to focus on the vision of why we're doing the task? Do you get so focused on the task and making sure that it's done with excellence that you forget to cast the vision? Or you could even ask, do the folks who work with you, the volunteers, or if you have a staff team, do they know why they're doing what they're doing, how it fits into the bigger picture? Whether they're watching a child or mowing the grass, right? Do they see the bigger picture? Visionary thinking. Motivation, inspiring and motivating team members to achieve their best is essential for high performance, right? Effective leaders recognize individual strengths and encourage team members to reach their full potential. And then empowerment. Delegating tasks and responsibilities and empowering team members to take ownership fosters a sense of autonomy and accountability. Now, I'm sure there are more, but those are the main ones that AI said are skills or competencies that great leaders, I think is the way I put it, have. And then if you go back, he talked about how if we're going to be lead with honor. Secondly, he says changing some of our attitudes, behaviors, and habits. And so I asked AI, what do the greatest leaders today, what attitudes do the greatest leaders today have? And these are the attitudes that AI gave me. And again, as it scoured the internet. The first one there is self-awareness. And again, I'll score yourself with these attitudes, all right? These attitudes that you're really good at, needs improvement, um, it's competent or really bad at. Self-awareness is the understanding of yourself, including personality traits, behaviors, anxieties, and emotions. While this is more inwardly focused trait, self-awareness and humility are paramount qualities of leadership. The better you understand yourself and recognize your own strengths and weaknesses, the more effective you can be as a leader. Do you know how other people view you and understand how you show up at work and at home? And think about what impacts that, right? In other words, how other people view you. For me, when I became a pastor, for example, I never thought about it the whole time I was actually in Arkansas. But when I came here, I remember Pastor Allen told me, was reminding me, I guess, that because people view you through your position, right? And so if you say something, it's going to be heard differently depending upon the position you hold. Even in the home, right? It's different if the youngest child says it as if the parent says it, right? And uh, humans have value. It's just that they hold different positions. And it's important to remember that because the response is always not based upon your skill, right? Because then people get a fall. It's like preachers who, go down the road and start a church and are always amazed that not as many people follow them as they thought that they would, right? Because they thought that the people who were, you know, behind them were behind them because of who they were, not just the position that they held. And so if you think about people view me so that I know myself, so that if I say something and you respond in a certain way, if I'm going to know myself, I got to know that some of your response is because of the chair I sit in. And if somebody else sat in the chair, you might respond in the same way. And if I sat in a different chair, you might respond a different way. Right. So I got to look at the position. Then you think people respond to us or see us through the way we present ourselves. Are we in shape? Are we out of shape? How do we dress? How prepared are we, right? You've seen people who are always messy and look like they never thought about where it is they're going, and other people that you've never seen unkept, right? You're like, if you saw them, I saw one of our council people. Where'd we see? Yeah, we saw him there. He was made up though. We saw him at the Galleria Mall, and I had never seen him in sweats, and I didn't recognize him. So, what else when you think about how people, the way you speak, right? Have you ever talked to somebody and they talk like this and it just like blows you away, right? Um, it, um, it, uh, a lot of times, even in the US, how well you speak, the language you speak, it impacts the way people perceive you because the way we're perceived is not, it's what you said, Pastor Matt. It's like what is. It's not what ought to be or what should be or what could be or what might be. Whether you're a woman or you're a man, depending on the situation that you're in and the environment you're in, right? We talk about that a lot. You right, what you say to the opposite sex can be perceived in a certain way, even if you don't mean it to be, right? So y- all of that is self-reflection or not self-reflection, but self-awareness, right? Oh, wow, that could be perceived that way. You know what I mean? I don't want that to be perceived that way. So I'm gonna behave differently to accomplish what I'm trying to lead or what I'm trying to do. Okay. So anyways, if you're not aware of that, then it's very difficult for us to work through, especially attitudes, right? So here's the attitudes that AI said that effective leaders have. The best leaders cultivate attitudes of integrity that trust, courage, growth mindset, coupled with empathy, adaptability, and the commitment to their team success. So Ask yourself, again, kind of score yourself, integrity and honesty. Leaders with integrity are honest and trustworthy, acting with strong moral principles. So, do you integrity, do you do what you say you're going to do? Trust. Building trust with their team is crucial. Leaders must be reliable and dependable. Are you trustworthy? The bad thing about trust is trust takes forever to build and can be lost in a moment, right? I was talking to a young man last night, and, I don't know what he had done, but he said they had done something and it hurt people. And the hardest part about rebuilding trust is how long it takes, right? And it's painful depending on what kind of trust is broken. Courage. Leaders need the courage to make difficult decisions, take calculated risks, and stand up for what they believe in. How much courage do you have? Do you have an attitude of courage? Do you display courage? Right? It's like Steph and I made a commitment, and I'm not saying that we never broke it, but we never wanted to discipline our kids out of anger. Right? Because I didn't want to discipline them to make me feel better. I wanted to make sure that I disciplined them for them to be better. So you don't want to mistake, anger as courage. In other words, you can stand up against a supervisor, or you can challenge, somebody who's negative when you get angry or when they attack you, when they create emotion. That's not necessarily courage. Courage, right, is your willingness to do that even when you're not per se emotionally engaged. Number 5, a growth mindset. Right? What's your attitude towards growth? And that, is evident by what you do. Are you reading? Are you learning? Are you growing? Empathy and compassion. Leaders who understand and share the feelings of their team's members can foster a more positive and productive environment. And then adaptability. The ability to adapt to changing circumstances and embrace change is essential for navigating challenges and seeing opportunities. Again, all of these, you have to be really self-aware, because people who are not adaptable to change just think they're right. Right? They don't see themselves as not being adaptable. They just see you as being wrong. Right? Now, that doesn't mean you're not wrong. It just might mean that I might have to look really deep to determine whether I'm adaptable or not. It's kind of like if, church relevancy changes over time. And, there was a time when we did, it was all hymns. Some of you don't even know what a hymn is, all right? But you did all hymns. And most churches, unless they were giant churches, would have an organ, not a pipe organ. They just have electric organ. I don't know what electric organ, and a piano, right? And if you were charismatic church, you might have a bass guitar. All right. Well, that's really off the rocker if you had drums, but anyways, that was what was normal. Big churches would have an orchestra, and then all of a sudden they did. They added the drums, and they started adding, and they changed the music to where it sounded more like what was on the radio. And they would do secular music. And the philosophy was this in the 90s, let's say, when this change was going on. A lot of fights, a lot of churches split up over music. Tons of churches split up over music. And the folks who were bringing about the change were like, we just want to be more relevant. We want people who are coming to church not be freaked out by sitting on an old technology called a pew, listening to old music called a hymn, and then believe that the message somehow is relevant to their life. So what if they were to sit in chairs like they do everywhere else and listen to a music stylistically like they do on the radio, so that the message comes across as relevant? Not the Bible's relevant, but do they hear it as relevant? And, that was the thing. We want to do the style of music's on the radio. Well, as you know, music on the radio is not static, right? It moves along. And what I've noticed is that the same folks who were like, hey, we just want to be relevant and do music like is heard on the radio, aren't quite as excited to change stylistically in the church as the music has changed on the radio, right? And that made me think, we're a lot we and see, they would have said we're just adapting. We're just adapting to the culture, when in reality, they were adapting to their culture. And that's how you really get to define whether or not you're adaptable. How adaptable are you to changing to something that's not your culture? Right? You guys are just coming from Lima. The U.S. is a different culture, right? Um, so it's like that's going to take adaptability to be able or if you go to Lima or you go to Cuba, which is, I mean, takes forever to do anything in Cuba, and it's like, can I be adaptable to that? Or am I going to look down, right? I'm not adapting to a culture if I'm looking down on the culture that how do I, connect and communicate? So I think, again, self-awareness is really important with that. Let me do the last one. So if you go back to the first page, right, he says, and there is a price to pay if you want to lead. And he talks about the pain, right? And so the question that I asked was, what kind of pain and suffering do the best leaders experience? That's what I asked AI. And it said the best leaders often experience loneliness, rejection, unpopularity, and criticism for making difficult decisions that may temporarily alienate their team while also being a burden of others' suffering and challenges. And he says, here's a more detailed breakdown. So let's go through these. And how well do you deal with these emotionally? Think about it in that way. Loneliness and isolation. Great leaders often carry the weight of decisions and responsibilities alone, leading to the feelings of loneliness and isolation. You've often heard it's lonely at the top. John Maxwell has said forever, if it's lonely at the top, that means that you're doing it wrong. But there is a loneliness with the responsibility that comes from being the leader at the end of the day. So are you comfortable? Doesn't mean isn't pain-free, but do you emotionally deal with that? How about unpopularity and rejection? Making tough decisions that may not be popular can lead to unpopularity, even rejection from those they lead. I shared last night, every biblical leader was rejected by their people, right? Joseph, Moses, all the prophets, Jeremiah, and of course, Jesus, So the fickleness of the people you lead, which is all of, right? We're all leaders and followers. We're all fickle, right? We vote a different president, or a different party and different governors and different policies and all that stuff. It's like, I like this. And then, that guy's a bum. I like this person, How about criticism and blame? Leaders are often at the target of criticism and blame, even when they're trying to do what is best for the organization or the team. How do you deal with that? Effectively. Because sometimes criticism is true. Sometimes it's not. So how do you determine what's helpful and what's not? Right? That's what makes it difficult. If everybody's just an idiot, it's a lot easier to deal with criticism. Right? But if there could be truth to it, that means, when are you most likely to think everybody's an idiot? When you're winning. Yeah. I'm winning. I mean, look at my bank account. You see you know what I mean? Right. That's why you look at Elon Musk or even a Donald Trump today, who get lots of criticism, right? What you think? I think to myself, I don't know how do you get up every day knowing so many people hate you? Well, you got billions of dollars in the bank. That's how. Right. You know what I'm saying? Now, I'm not saying that's the right way to deal with criticism. All right. But I'm just saying, it's like, get your first billion and then we'll talk, So when you're winning is when you need to make sure that you have some kind of pathway for criticism to get to you. Because if not, you'll become, how many people have you seen become arrogant and fall? Because they intentionally isolated themselves from criticism. And so you have to know what is the pathway that it can get to you. Carrying the burden of others' pains, leaders often bear the weight of their teams and organizations' struggles, challenges, and failures. Paul said that was his biggest challenge, right? In ministry, it's a huge challenge. Like I said, we went and visited Franklin and his wife Anita, Pastor Danny and Giselle yesterday, and it's just watching someone. It's heartbreaking to see someone deal with disease, whether it's cancer or watching my dad, but it's so difficult to watch the folks who love the person who's dealing with the disease. To watch, not only the helplessness with which you feel, but the helplessness in which they feel. Ministry, last night when I was talking to this young man and you could see the pain on his face over the regret of some decisions he's made. And I don't know what decisions he made, but there's such a helpless feeling on my part because I know that the road ahead of him, I know at the end he can be victorious. If God was done with him, he'd be in heaven. But as long as our heart beats and our lung takes in air, there's still an opportunity to become what God created us to be, to change the world, right? But there's a long path from where he's at to that. And it's weighty to whether or not he will persevere. Now, it's not necessarily our responsibility, but that doesn't mean that you don't have to carry that. The temptation is always for us in ministry to become so cold that we protect our heart and don't feel those things, right? It's like every time I walk out, I never know where I'm pointing. I think this way. Okay? Is that the South Lot? Every time I walk out there and I look over there at those fields and I see hundreds of people that are over there, especially like on a Sunday morning, and I'm burdened, not because they're over there and they're not at church, but I know that 8 or 9 out of every 10 people are not Christ followers. They're not engaged in a community. And it's like, how many of them, if the scripture is true, are going through insecurities? And I do believe, right? I believe what God says we experience without him. Doesn't mean, right? And it's like, how many of those kids are going to go home and mom and dad are going to be fighting? And they're going to go to their room and they're going to turn on their computer because mom and dad are always fighting. And they're wondering whether mom and dad are going to stay together. Or maybe they're going to go home and mom's going to be with someone that's not their dad. And it's a bad situation. Or how many of them that are adults over there are struggling with addiction or are just unhappy. They don't enjoy their job, right? They don't have a sense of peace. And here we are, we're just less than 100 yards away. And while we as individuals and as people do not have the answers, but Jesus has, he has the answers. It's like, well, how do we reach them? Right? How do we not communicate in such a way that they feel judged? But how do we reach them? Because ultimately Christ has what they're looking for, but it's not the path that they necessarily want to go. You know what I mean? It's a weight that you have to carry in ministry. And sometimes it can be overwhelming, or it can be like, I'm just not going to feel with that. I'm just not going to deal with that. I'm just going to do my job. And when we get to that point, it impacts our ability to lead. Because, in my prayer is that it wouldn't just be something that was felt in ministry, but it'd be my prayer that I was talking with Jimmy earlier, and, he works at a hospital, at something in maintenance, um, and he was talking about how, as he's goes in to do whatever he does in some of those hospital rooms, he's talking about how he ministers to the people that were in that room, and he's telling about Miss Johnson and, all these names. And I just thought, encouraging them or trying to make them laugh and praying with them if they were open to that, those kind of things. And I thought, what if, CEOs went to work with that kind of mindset? What if managers went to work that with that kind of mindset? What if coaches and teachers, I don't mean to preach the gospel. I just mean if they looked at their people, not as people to accomplish a task, but people they were responsible to help grow, not just for the company, but as humanity. What can I do as a CEO to make sure that the people that work for me have better marriages, or become better parents, or have more fulfilling dating relationships? And, it might be easy for us to say that that's just impossible, but the reality is most people just don't want to carry that weight. They don't want to deal with that pain, right? Because of failure. So anyways, carrying the burdens of others, I think, is a big one. Dealing with conflict and disagreement. How good are you at that? Leaders must navigate conflict and disagreement. Do you neglect it? Do you walk away from it? Do you step into it? Burnout and health issues. The constant pressure and demands of leadership can lead to burnout, stress, and even health issues, right? How do you take care of your health? How do you deal with your health, right? How do you deal with weariness, all those things? Personal limitations. Leaders may struggle with their own personal limitations and challenges, which can impact their ability to lead effectively, right? How do you deal with the reality that you have skin to, right? You get angry too. You say the wrong thing too, right? You have temptations as well, and you give in to those temptations at times. How do you deal with that? The pain of disappointment. You guys have probably never experienced that, have you? Right? The experience of deep disappointment when their team or organization fails to meet expectations. The pain of transitions. Leaders must experience pain when staff members leave, especially if they are important to the team or organization. Right? That's always painful. Especially in ministry, because ministry is different from I would say almost any other organization, because it's personal. It's meant to be personal, right? You're not just co-workers. You're on the journey together. The moment you pray for somebody, right? That's a more personal and relational aspect. So anytime disappointment and transitions and all those things are painful. And then the pain of misunderstanding. Leaders may experience the pain of being misunderstood, of not being appreciated for their efforts. Right? That's not, what you felt. It's not what I meant. But it's kind of like anytime you speak to a group, you're going to be misunderstood. Even if you're good, even if you're detailed, you're going to be misunderstood. Right? It's just and some of it's going to be, I got to be a better communicator. Some of it's going to be, people are people, and they're going to hear what they hear. And then they're going to accuse you. They're going to determine your motives based on what they heard, even if it's not what you said. And it's like, are you okay with that? Because if you're not, you'll spend your whole time trying to convince others of what you said or didn't say, as opposed to moving forward. So here's what I challenge you to do, is go back now and look at your numbers, and then come up with your own personal growth plan to progress, right? Like what books, because there are books on all these subjects. There's a scripture that speaks to these. There's tons of podcasts and videos, and there's a million ways in which you can grow in these areas, right? We're starting a university to help you grow in some of these areas. So what's your plan? Because if you don't have a plan, it's not going to happen. We all have to be intentional, and this can be a great scorecard. And if you hang on to it, whether the online version or this version, and then, maybe not every month like you celebrate your dating, but every quarter to go back and look and see if that number's changed. It's gotten better, it's gotten weaker. And it could really be a tool that God can use.